Russia continues to bombard Ukraine while Western diplomats keep looking for a good deal for Ukraine that just doesn't exist. And this is starting to have real ramifications. I've told you many times here, and especially in the last number of days, even, that war is not merely about counting. It's not merely about looking at the spreadsheets, though that is very important. But there's also a really crucial psychological element of it. We saw that on painful display in the end of the Afghan war with the United States when in April or August of 2021, when the United States had already signaled that they were leaving and they're going to leave the Afghan military and the Afghan government on their own, that they panicked and ended up making deals with the Taliban. And then the whole thing just collapsed in a minute. Even though they had stood for 20 years, once the United States was physically on the way out, then everything fell apart there. There is a risk of a situation like that. And I see the dynamic starting to play out. You're starting to see a great concern on the Ukraine side, and you're starting to see a lot of cocky statements coming out of the Russian side. I don't have time to show all the clips today, but especially when you're looking at Russian media, they are getting much more provocative in and confident and cocky in their statements. You're hearing certainly a lot of things from some of the politicians on the Russian side and some of the Russian generals, which we'll get to shortly. But first of all, let's see some of the reason for this and some of the reason for the concern on the Ukraine side, and it's not without warrant. And first of all, we're going to look at something that President Trump said barely an hour, I think, ago, maybe an hour and a half, something like that, where he was talking about his current situation and his dealings with Ukraine.
I think we're doing very well with Russia. But right now they're bombing the hell out of Ukraine, and I'm finding it more difficult, frankly, to deal with Ukraine. And they don't have the cards. They don't have the cards. As you know, we're meeting in Saudi Arabia on sometime next week, early. And we're talking, I find that in terms of getting a final settlement, it may be easier dealing with Russia, which is surprising because they have all the cards. I mean, they're bombing the hell out of them right now. And I put a statement in, a very strong statement. Can't do that. Can't do that.
Mr. President.
We're trying to help them. And Ukraine has to get on the ball and get a job done. Michael, could you come up here? I see Michael back there. Yeah, good. I'm glad. He's traveling all over the world. I just saw him come in the door. Could you give a little definition of what's going on, please?
Sure. Well, the president has been crystal clear, and he's been clear to all sides. The fighting has to stop. Both sides need to get to the table. We had a good engagement. Both leaders have said only President Trump could do so, and only he has been able to do so. We had an initial engagement with the Russians. The Ukrainians had a great opportunity to bind our economies together through that mineral deal. Unfortunately, that didn't go so well, but we think we're going to get things back on track. Secretary Rubio, myself and the Ukrainian delegation will be meeting in Saudi Arabia next week to get these talks back on track, get the ceasefire in place, and drive peace home under President Trump's leadership.
I think both parties want to settle. I think if I wasn't president, this war would have had no chance of settlement, zero chance. But I think we're going to get it settled and stopped.
I mean, you can't really argue with that. I mean, obviously, it's pretty self-evident. The war would definitely have continued on if Kamala Harris had won the presidential election, because that was their standard deal. Just continue on with no change from the previous administration, and the Ukraine side would continue to have lost, and there wouldn't have even been the possibility. No one would have even been looking to get this over. Now, for Volodymyr Zelenskyy, the Ukrainian leader, he's still not on board with this. Now, you may recall that Mike Waltz there mentioned the debacle in the Oval Office on Friday of last week when, everything just exploded and went crazy because he said he wasn't on the game. And there's explained many times that all the White House officials, to include the president, the vice president, Secretary of State, Mike Waltz, all of them said that everyone had agreed that it was going to be a minerals deal signing, and then we're going to move on to the next level, trying to figure out the part about getting the war over. But as Waltz reiterated there, the idea was, which should have been a positive thing for the Ukraine side, to get the U.S. economically invested in the continuation of the Ukraine side. And then they would worry about getting things done after that. But he's walked out, and everything fell apart from that point forward. At the joint session of Congress night before last, when President Trump said he had got this letter from Zelenskyy, and now he's going to work under the leadership, et cetera. You've probably seen our episode yesterday where Zelenskyy at nearly the same time was still saying, I'm not going to change my constitution. I'm not going to give up any territory, and I still want guarantees. And that's still in contradiction to what the White House is saying. And you can see that the patience of the president is starting to wear thin. And when he's sitting there saying openly, I think I can work more with Russia than I can with Ukraine, that's very, very telling. And you can see that the patience is nearly worn out on the president's side. And that was also reflected in something that his General Keith Kellogg, his advisor for the Ukraine war, also went to the Council on Foreign Relations and actually said a few things in a different way that were equally not so good from the Ukraine side.
What is the concrete effect of the abrupt end of military resupply to Ukraine and the end of the provision of intelligence and targeting data?
The best way I can describe it is sort of like hitting a mule with a 2x4 across the nose. You got their attention, and it is significant, obviously, because of the support that we give. Okay, but it's one way to sort of get your attention to do it. But it's a pause. It's not an end. It's not like, Michael, it's not like they didn't know this was coming. They got fair warning it was coming. I told them, and they were told last week as well.
So you have President Trump saying hours ago that he thinks he's got a better shot at working with Russia than he does with Ukraine. And then here's Keith Kellogg saying, comparing Ukraine to a mule. And we had to hit him upside the head with the 2x4. What he's very clearly articulating there is that the Zelenskyy government and the Ukraine side are not wanting to play ball. As he said, and everybody else has said, there was an agreement already between the United States and Zelenskyy about what was going to happen in the Oval Office. That fell apart. Now then, even on the State of the Union or the joint session of Congress, Trump again thinks he's got a plan, and then Zelenskyy contradicts that again. So it's being very clear now that the United States doesn't feel like that they're dealing with a partner whom they can trust. And unfortunately, I'm not talking about Vladimir Putin, because I think that even though they don't like them, even though that they're the offensive side and they're the ones that invaded Ukraine and all that, he recognizes that they'll pretty much do what they say. And, this whole issue of trust but verify, et cetera. Here's the big point. And I know, and I was actually on the BBC radio last night and got into a bit of a discussion with the host, because what she talked about there and the viewpoint that she had is what I see all over the place in the West. And that is this belief that there's a good deal to be had, that if Trump just would stop being a problem and stop holding back ammunition, stop holding back intelligence capabilities for the Ukraine side, if he would in fact start giving a bunch more stuff, then we could have a position of strength. I've shown you for the NATO Secretary General, Macron, Starmer, Scholz from Germany. I mean, they keep saying these same kind of things. Kaja Kallas, the chief diplomat for the European Union, just ad infinitum. In fact, they're all singing from the same sheet of music, and they're all wrong. There is no path to Ukraine even holding on, folks. So people want in the West, and certainly many in the United States, they want to condemn the Trump administration, and they want to condemn Trump himself for how rude is he to say those kinds of things? How rude is he to cut these things off, and how awful for him not to keep giving stuff to the Ukraine side. But what President Trump clearly understands is that there's not a path forward, because you had 30 straight months of tactical losses and failure from the Ukraine side. Now, what logic, what ration could any of those people in the West offer up to say that even though we'd failed for 30 straight months, and maybe even more than that, but for sure going back to the 30th months, Ukraine has been given everything that the West would give, and certainly everything under the Biden administration that they asked for, maybe not in the terms of numbers, though it was, and by the way, let me point this out, 10,000 military vehicles of various kinds, tanks, armored personnel carriers, artillery pieces, etc. 10,000. So I don't want to hear anybody say, oh, well, he short-shrifted them. 10,000 pieces from the United States alone, and it never made a difference. And so Trump sees that. And so he's like, why would I want to pour more good money, more equipment into an empty hole? And there's one other thing that Trump apparently understands, and this was Trump himself has said a version of this, but at that same event at the Council on Foreign Relations, General Kellogg said, we recognize this about the other half of this equation.
The one thing you never want to do with the Russians is get into an attrition war. I mean, this is the same nation that in World War II lost 70,000 troops dead in Stalingrad in 6 months and continued to fight. So you have to kind of think about how do they look, how do we want to go to, and you don't want to get into a war like that.
Okay, well, he's a little off on his figures. It wasn't 70,000. That was probably more like 70,000 a month. It was more than that, actually. The Russian side lost over 1 million people, and it may have even been higher than that. I think it was 2 million total on both sides of this, the epitome of a meat grinder situation. And the Russians kept going on. They lost, by conservative estimates, somewhere around 20 million people in World War II, and they never stopped. They never even considered stopping. And they, no matter what the circumstances, no matter how many people they lost, they kept going. And they drove all the way until they had victory. That's not the only time they've done that. That's part of the Russian psyche. I promise you that the character of the Russians, if you will, is historically long suffering. They've had so many periods of foreign invasion, of economic catastrophe, of self-imposed disaster from some of the Soviet leaders, the purges that Stalin inflicted on his own people. I mean, they are long suffering. And so they have, even when they had the revolution in 1917, only that came after 5 million of their soldiers were killed, and there was no prospect for anything different. That's how high the price have to be for them to go back. The current situation, they've lost probably somewhere around 100,000 killed in action and 250,000 wounded. And while that's a high number per se, in terms of Russian history, it's not. And I can also promise you, based on what Russian people are saying, based on what Russian leaders are saying, and based on what the Russian side is doing, those things are all in concert, and they're lined up with what General Kellogg there talked about, the historical pattern of the Russian side. They are not going to stop until they have achieved all that they want. I've told you just a couple of weeks ago where the vice foreign minister, Sergei Ryabkov, said that only if all of the terms of Russia that put out by Putin in June 14th of last year are accomplished, only then will they stop fighting. They won't stop fighting until that time. And if anybody needed a cherry on top of that, you had Putin himself at a meeting a couple of days ago where he was meeting with war widows and mothers of fallen soldiers. And some of them have said, hey, don't let our sacrifices be in vain.
Our sons will be at peace when the conflict ends, though we must go to the end. We must not yield to anyone.
We will do no such thing. We must find a peace solution that would suit us and that would ensure lasting peace for our country for a long-term historical perspective. We do not need anything that is not ours, but we do not give up our own. And we need such a solution that would ensure stable development of our country in peace and security.
And listen, okay, it's one thing to say that. I mean, you see Zelenskyy says stuff all the time. It's just not backed up on the ground. It's not in any kind of reality. You saw before January 20th, you saw the Biden administration said all kinds of things and all kinds of lofty claims and that they're going to win. And as long as it takes and all that kind of nonsense, but you never saw it backed up on the ground. So here's Putin saying this today. Is that just rhetoric that he's saying for the domestic audience, for his television cameras, or is it backed up on the ground? Well, it's backed up on the ground, and we're going to show you. I haven't done a tactical update in a while, so I'm going to do a quick recap here, and we're going to start in one of the bigger areas because there's been a lot of movement here recently, and that is in the Kursk area. And here on this on the map you see here, this is the map from August 16th of last year at the high water mark when Ukraine made its incursion into the Kursk area, and all that area, and then the thatched blue is all the parts of Russia that they had possessed. The little squiggly line there at the bottom, and the light blue, that's the Russia-Ukraine border. The light blue is Ukraine. All the dark blue is everything that Russia lost to Ukraine at their high water mark. Then you see in November of 2024, all those red areas are now stuff that Russia had reclaimed. The yellow areas were areas of contention. Now you look on the map on the right, and that is the current situation on the ground right now. And you see it continues to get smaller and smaller. And I want to zoom in here on the Kursk area itself, on an active battle map here, because this is what's going on now. So this is what in the other map was the light blue area. This is Suja, the one big town, medium-sized town that now is the only thing left of the Ukraine side. They had to gone way over here. They had territory over here. They had stuff in the north. It's all been squeezed to this. But in the last just 48 hours or so, Russia has started to make more penetrations. They actually invaded into Ukraine territory in the Sumy Oblast right here. And Russia has now started making advancements in this area. Then over on the right side, you remember about a month or so ago, I said it looked like that Russia was getting ready to have a pincer to close off the neck of this, because if you can close off the supplies in here, the rest of this will die on the vine. So you don't have to like conquer every forest, every field, every village to be able to push the Ukraine out. You just have to cut off their supplies. And now then, I was perplexed as to why Russia hadn't done that earlier. Some analysts suggest that they intentionally kept this path open because it was useful to the Russian side to have Ukraine relentlessly put all these reinforcements in, all these vehicles, everything else, because as long as there were troops fighting here, they weren't fighting in the west, in the eastern part of the country, rather on the eastern front. And so it was easier for Russia to just keep this surrounded, basically like shooting fish in a barrel. And there was allegedly tens of thousands of Ukrainian casualties that were no longer available anywhere else, and that there were probably thousands of combat vehicles of various types that were also lost, which were never available to go elsewhere. But now it appears that Russia is saying, all right, any of this talk about let's trade the Kursk area in some kind of negotiated, I think he's going to take that off the map and say, no, we're not going to cut it off. So if they move through here, by these incursions right here, this one main supply road, I think you can see that pretty clearly here. This is the last remaining major supply road. And because the weather is on and off good and bad at this time of year, the Ukraine side is very often restricted to that one road. Well, now then, the Russians have it under what's called fire control. They can see the roads from here. They can see it from here, and they can bring it under artillery fire, certainly drone and missile and rockets and other kinds of things. But now that it's becoming much, much more difficult to get any kind of supplies in to the approximate 15,000 Ukrainian troops up in this area. So they're almost encirclement already. And just before we came on air here, I read some reports on Telegram that are claiming that there is some initial evidence rather, that the Ukraine side has recognized that this is now a lost cause, and they're going to go ahead and they have actually started redeployment. And that's the only thing that makes sense, because if they just keep fighting here, at some point, these two pincers are going to meet in the middle, and nobody will be able to get any ammunition, food, water, medical support, no additional reinforcements, etc. And everyone in here will either die or be taken captured. So it would be pointless and catastrophic for the Ukraine side to keep going here. Unfortunately, they do have some experience with that. We saw it in Mariupol. We saw it in Avdiivka. We saw it in Bakhmut, the Chasiv Yar of here in just the last few months. So there's a lot of history of Ukraine making the wrong decisions here. But for the sake of those troops that are still fighting, I hope they withdraw soon. But that's the big problem there. And then let's go into a couple of the other areas that are really important, and that is in the Toretsk and the Chasiv Yar area. So we've been talking about these going on for quite a while now. Chasiv Yar down at here is now getting closer and closer to complete Russian control. There's some of these areas, these are thatched. This is control. These are challenged areas. Russia has just took another area that was under the contested, no longer. There's some mix of Ukraine and Russian here. This is still some Ukraine, but you see they're still doing the same thing. They are just clinging on to every building, just not giving up anything. So it's block by block, building by building, and all that does is, number one, for the Russian side, it makes it a lot easier to try and kill the Ukrainian soldiers when they can come and you look, I'll just zoom in here and you can see it. When the Russians own this building and the Ukrainians own this building, to try to get the Ukrainians out, they have the cover and concealment of these trees here, this building, and so they can fire at point blank range. Ukraine won't see them or can't see them until they're in direct fire range, hand grenade range, where you can throw hand grenades, etc. And obviously you have drones, and those other things are always an ever-present possibility. But if you just withdrew from the area and said, all right, we're going to move back into, say, these are fortified areas right here. We're going to withdraw these guys back to here. Now then, if Russia wants to kill these same troops that are here right now, and instead they're going to put them here, now they've got to go across all this open terrain where the Ukraine side can get them hundreds of meters, if not kilometers, to the front. And that makes it so much more difficult for the Russian side. But instead, by keeping this, this historically unsupportable position to hang on to every building, all you do is make it easier for your opponent to get you. And that's what's happening here. A little bit further down here to Toretsk, Russia had claimed that they had captured this city, but the Ukraine side went on a counter-offensive and a counterattack, rather, and they actually clawed some of this back. And almost all this was in Russian control, and then now they have charged some of it back. The problem being, you can't sustain this. And while it may have been a very heroic thing, and on a tactical level, they got some success, folks, look, I mean, you can just see Russia has all of this owned. They can continue to roll reinforcements up. They have hundreds of thousands more combat troops than the Ukraine side. So this is going to eventually just be nothing but a last ditch effort to try and win and to achieve tactical success at no benefit operationally and definitely none strategically. So it's just going to be pointless. And then the other area down here, the Pokrovsk, which we've been talking about a lot, this had gone on something of a stalemate in terms of territorial acquisition. Russia had moved up and made a lot of progress, and then they basically stopped along this current line here. But the fighting didn't stop. And this, again, gets to the biggest issue of the Russian way of fighting, is that they're not as focused on territorial acquisition. That's a secondary issue. They are still focused on the destruction of the Ukrainian armed forces. Ukraine, because they didn't want to lose Pokrovsk because of its important connecting into the north and south of their lines, continue to fill reinforcements in here. A similar dynamic that we saw in the Kursk area was the Russians appeared to have stopped their attempts at forward momentum and instead were content to just continue shooting fish in a barrel, and all the reinforcements the Ukraine side kept putting in, they keep killing. And as we've told you so many times before, Ukraine doesn't have enough troops to meet these needs. So they're running low on reinforcements. They're running low on reserves. All the things that you need to keep fighting, they don't have them. They're starting to lose them. And so now then, my screen has gone black. Something different here, but I should have taken the screen off there, but there we go. Thanks. Sorry, a little technical glitch there. So you see that over and over, you see that there is no path to anything positive for the Ukraine side. It is irrational to continue looking for a good answer. It's irrational for the European Union, for NATO, all the European contingent especially, to continue to say, we're looking for security guarantees. We're looking for, we're going to put peacekeepers on the ground here. They're continuing to talk that. They're keeping on saying, no, I know if we just do a little more, if we just provide this here, then we can succeed. You had Zelenskyy, I think it was yesterday, maybe the day before, say, okay, how's about this? How about a partial ceasefire? We'll just pause in the sea and on the air. And so that way, I don't know what he was actually thinking. I mean, obviously it would be beneficial for him to stop the Russian missiles, because in that first clip I showed you where President Trump said that Russia's just pounding the hell out of them right now and bombing them. Over the last 2 nights especially, there have just been extraordinary amounts of Russian aerial attacks, the Kinzhal missiles, the KH-101s, other kind of cruise missiles, drones, etc. They have been just splattering all over the Ukrainian country, all the way to the western border, hitting gas supply depots, energy infrastructure facilities, knocking out their ability to heat their people, knocking out their ability mainly to prevent them from having electricity to create weapons of war, ammunition, all those kinds of things. And especially over the last 48 hours, the last 2 nights have just been relentless. So, of course, Zelenskyy wants a ceasefire in the air, which, why would the Russians agree to that? Because that's one of their unmitigated advantages. And one of the reasons why they say there's not going to be any ceasefire. not a partial one, not a complete one, until they have an issue that they can live with on the ground. And General Kellogg also in that same interview, well, no, actually, this was in a different interview. He was answering the question about why do we withhold ammunition and intelligence. And then, even though I give him credit for the other things he said, he's kind of off base on this one, because he made this statement that actually nobody can actually win this on the ground.
The levels of destruction is horrific. It's World War II level of destruction. And the president sees that. And he said consistently that he wants the war to stop, that he needs to end the killing. He's been very, very good at that. And when he looks at the Europeans, he's trying to bring them along the same way, saying, look, you've got to come to some type of negotiated solution to this. This war is not going to be decided on the battlefield. It's just not.
Yeah, but is it just not? Because even the Sky News with former Air Force pilot Sean Bell, even he, who's been pretty pro-Ukrainian, went on Sky News early today and kind of painted a different picture.
And there's been a lot of optimism around these peace talks. I have to say, from a military perspective, I think a degree of caution is probably worked. The officials are meeting. They're not in a stalemate on the battlefield. Russia is still on the front foot. So it's very difficult to see why either of them is actually prepared to stop at the moment. President Zelenskyy doesn't have many chips available to him, quite bluntly, at the moment. He's on the back foot. He's losing the war. His drones are conducting longer-range strikes into Russia, quite effectively taking out oil and inflicting a lot of casualties on Russia. And, of course, the Europeans are becoming more and more determined to help. But if you look at it from President Putin's perspective, you know, he is on the front foot. He's winning. The downside, of course, is domestic economy, inflation is running riot. And if we look around the map, one of the things we have to try and work out is what is Russia's agenda, what's their aim. Almost certainly it's the Luhansk, Donetsk, Zaporizhia and Kherson oblasts, that infamous land bridge down to Crimea. And you could just about see here and here the areas that he doesn't yet hold. And that's one of the reasons Pokrovsk here is one of the key targets at the moment, because you get that logistics hub. It unlocks a lot more of the Donetsk region. But also Kursk, at the moment, you've still got Ukrainians only in about half the area they were. But President Putin is not going to want to negotiate whilst he's still got some Ukrainians on his soil.
Yeah, he's not going to. You saw that clip I played a minute ago where Putin is confidently saying, we're not going to stop. You had Sergei Lavrov yesterday at a press conference. We're not going to stop. There's not going to be a negotiated settlement until, there's not going to be a ceasefire until we have a deal that we can all live with. And what you have Sergei Lavrov also just repeatedly stating over and over, which he did again yesterday, and I think even earlier today on an interview, we're after the root causes. We don't want just to stop the fighting and have all the conditions that still exist so that this thing can start up again later, or that it leaves it unresolved. He said, we want the root causes of the war taken care of. And what that means is NATO. They want to make absolutely sure there is no NATO in the future for Ukraine, whatever's left of it, that there's no military alliance with even bilateral between NATO countries and Ukraine, that the Ukraine military has been reduced to, I think, 85,000 is the number I've heard some suggest, but it's some very small number, and that there won't be any peacekeepers from the European Union, for especially from NATO countries inside Ukraine. The Sergei Lavrov was very quick to talk about that here just in the last day or two, that he said, if any of those come in and we haven't agreed to it, then we'll simply consider them as enemy combatants and they'll be attacked just like the Ukraine troops are right now. Now, I think that the European Union side is coming around to recognizing that. And even when you're talking about Keir Starmer, and Emmanuel Macron, who have been the biggest advocates for this, I think they realize that without the full backing of the United States, it would be really stupid to put them in there, because the Secretary of State, Hegseth, Trump himself has said there's no Article 5 guarantees for any of those folks. If you do it, we're not in control of any European country. And if you want to do that, I guess that's your sovereign right to do so. But you got to know there won't be any Article 5 associated with that, because Article 5 is supposed to be if we're attacked, not if you send your troops into harm's way and get into a predictable clash. We're not going to come and backstop that, nor should anybody expect the United States to do so. But that is where we are right now. But here's the thing. It could get a lot worse. Again, I harken back to my interview on BBC last night, because it's similar to what so many in the West to this day still think, that there is if not a good deal, a semi-good deal, a not bad deal to be had. And we just got to negotiate it right, and just with the right inputs and the right pressure on Russia. Let's do more sanctions because that'll work, as it sure worked so good in the first, I want to say, like 18,000 times we've tried to sanction Russia. But yeah, maybe another one. Maybe it'll be that one will be the one that it's not going to. All of this stuff is nonsense. And Colonel Reisner, the Austrian colonel, is in charge of their professional development, the Austrian officers' professional development. He's been making excellent videos from the beginning of this war. And he just recently made another one to where he was showing if we don't make a negotiated deal where the lines currently are right now and under the conditions, the harsh conditions that the Russians have, he suggested it could get not just worse, but a lot worse.
A lot of people think, especially in the West, that this zone is pretty much going along the front line, maybe also going to the north, which is pretty much representing the border in between Russia and Ukraine. The Russian perspective is a completely different one. The Russians want to have everything east of Kiev. Why? Because already now it is possible, theoretically and practically, by using long-range weapons like the Storm Shadow, to hit a target by using that rocket from the area east of Kiev in direction of Moscow. So any demilitarized zone from the Russian side has to be pretty much everything east of the Dnieper to avoid any threat to Moscow by using from the Ukrainian or even European side missiles like the Storm Shadow. And if you now look in the Russian social media, then you pretty much can already see that idea. So you can see that pretty much Russia has occupied in the future maybe everything east of the Dnieper. And they also want to have the terrain to the west of the Dnieper and the south, because they want to deny any access of the Ukrainians to the Black Sea. They want to control Odessa, and they want to have a land bridge to Transnistria. And that will make Ukraine a landlocked country which no access to their important resources in the west and in the south of the country.
Okay, again, like I said, anyone can say anything. You know, how many times did we see over the last 3 years where a Ukraine general or a Ukraine leader said they were going to accomplish this and they were going to defeat that, or an American general like Ben Hodges or David Petraeus or any number of others continue to say, yeah, Ukraine was going to win. They're going to get better. They're going to seize this. They're going to take that, etc. How many times did you hear in the Kursk offensive that, yes, they finally have taken the fight to Moscow, and now then they're going to show them what's what. And now then you see that they're on the verge of losing it. Literally within days, they could finally be driven completely out there or captured or killed, one or the other. So that didn't work out. So just because some in the Russian side are saying they want that, the question is, can they get it? Well, some of the Russian leaders certainly seem to think so. And this was in just the last couple of days. One of the commanders of the Akhmet forces, the one that's actually fighting in the Kursk area, who's the commander of the Chechen Special Forces, proposed a general mobilization to throw a 2 million strong army into Europe potentially. He's saying, hey, listen, he's confident that what's going on right now is just a tip of the iceberg. And they continued going on down here. Let me see if I can find that. Oh, yeah, I must have lost that part here. Here it is. According to Aludinov, United Europe has already done everything it could, and Russia will achieve victory under any conditions. They will gather at their paddling pools 20 to 30,000 people. He's referring to the proposed peacekeeping troops. How will they be better than the Ukrainians we fought? It's impossible to defeat Russia on the battlefield, Ludinov said. He added that the Ukrainians are in high spirit, stronger. He said the Ukrainians are in high spirit, stronger than all of the combined armies. He actually said, listen, yeah, look, the Ukrainians themselves are tough fighters. They respect them, because he's been fighting them now for 7 months just in this one area right here. And they've obviously been fighting for, now into the 4th year before. So they're beating them, but they have respect for the tenaciousness of the Ukraine army. They don't have that kind of respect for the Western armies. And I think that there's good reason for that. I mean, I've told you recently, I'm concerned now for the first time about the Baltics. I wasn't before because Russia had shown all the interest up to even as late as June of last summer that they were willing to have the war ended pretty much where it was on the 4 Oblast, the administrative borders. It could have been over there. They were concerned about their security. That would have done it as long as they got the other things with the demilitarization, denazification. It could have stopped there. But the West didn't do it. They continued fighting. Now Russia has had to continue to fight more, and there is a less and less willingness on the Russian side to give any even moderately good conditions to the Ukraine / the Western side. And if their push comes to shove, it's not out of the ordinary. Listen, this guy is not just some general. He's not just somebody that's out of control. This guy is really close to Putin. And for him to say, maybe we should mobilize, I think the number was several million, and they said that they would form an army of 2 million to go into Western Europe. That's what he said. That's what he offered. But did you see any pushback coming from the Kremlin? Did you see any pushback coming from any of the Telegram channels? Any pushback coming from even Dmitry Peskov or maybe Sergei Lavrov saying, okay, well, hold your horses there? Not a word. Nothing at all. And in fact, it's getting a lot of the rounds where a lot of on the social media, especially, are agging that on. Because listen, if it came to a general war with the West in conventional terms, obviously my biggest concern has always been that if it escalates, then it would all too likely go nuclear. And that still remains a paramount concern. But if somehow the two sides were able to say, we're going to have nuclear parity, we're not going to use them on each other, but it had any kind of conventional basis, we cannot, listen to me carefully here, folks, from the West. We cannot fight a conventional war against Russia right now. We are flat-footed. They have spent the last 2+ years of rolling up all of their industrial capacity, of generating a force generation capacity within their country where they can rapidly bring not just civilians who have never been in, but they have a large pool of people who have had some training in the reserves, et cetera, that they could mobilize and put back into uniforms. And they now have the infrastructure and the logistics to actually handle it. They could put a very large field force in the field if it came down to it. We cannot. We don't have it. We have it's shocking how small the armies of NATO are. I think France is the biggest at 200,000. UK is like 175 or something like that. And again, that's the total force structure. That's not the actual fighting units, which are much smaller. None of these folks have any kind of combat experience at all. And what little they have had, like in Afghanistan or Iraq or Syria or Africa in some places, that is not the same. That's not comparable. It's as though they had none, because it's meaningless when you are only fighting somebody that doesn't have air power, drones, air defense, weapons, all those kinds of things. Russia has them all. So our industrial capacity is still at peacetime. We haven't mobilized up. It took Russia a full year and a half to get their forces up to speed there. And now then they have it. Their industrial capacity, they're at a wartime economy, et cetera. We're still at a peacetime case on every category. We don't have these large numbers of people. And I promise you, if any of the West suddenly said we're going to have a mobilization and force people into, you would see people revolting against their countries, because they were like, hang on, why am I going to fight a war against Russia? All you guys had to do was end it in December 2021. At Minsk in 2015, you could have shut it down in February 20 or April 2022, June 2024, February, March 2025. End it now. We're not going to go fight a war that otherwise we would not be threatened. And I don't think that Russia would actually make good on that play unless the West actually took some kind of more provocative action and put at risk Russia. Russia needs to feel like that they have security on their western borders, and they've put forth many proposals to get that done over the year. We keep rejecting it. Now, fortunately, it looks like President Trump recognizing that. He said it himself. You saw General Kellogg has said it. And again, these things aren't off the cuff. These are things that are well thought out by the team. President Trump recognizing what Russia has done when they get mobilized. Consider that situation that Kellogg talked about in World War II. Russia had lost huge, massive numbers in the war leading up to the battle at Stalingrad. And then they started mobilizing after that, but then there was no price they weren't willing to pay. Once they felt that they were on an existential struggle, there was no price they wouldn't pay. That the people, and there is no evidence that this version of the Russians are any different than the previous ones are. So if that's the case, why would you want to test getting it resurrected? The best thing that the West can do right now is just belatedly acknowledge reality, bring this thing to an end, let this get off the table, take all the, the personal hits, the embarrassment, the humiliation, etc. The claims of you abandoned Ukraine, you failed, and whatever. People are going to say it. You can't stop that. Those words, though, don't change the facts on the ground. And if we listen to those things, if our leaders do, and continue to press a losing situation, it can get a lot worse. It can get like that map that Colonel Reisner showed. It could, and if that's not accepted, it could even get worse than that. So we're not at the worst part yet. And this is the best place. And I really like what President Trump is doing right now. He's putting pressure on the Ukraine side. He's withholding ammunition. He's withholding intelligence support. He's saying that he thinks he has a better shot at working out something with Putin. Kellogg says it's like hitting a mule upside the head with the 2x4 to try and get their attention. He used that exact phrase. If the Ukraine side has any kind of self-preservation actions left in them, they'll take this deal right now. They'll do the mineral deal. They'll reach the negotiated settlement. They'll whatever it takes. The administrative borders of those territories, a new election so that they're actually a democratic government, and the reduction of their armed forces. Those are all painful things that would be ugly to do, but that is the best thing they can do at this point because of all the failures that everybody in the West, to include the United States, to include Kiev, has been unwilling to accede to reality before. Because of those past failures, this is the best you can get. And we'll see if they have learned from that past, from the pain that's already been endured, or if we're going to keep on trying to, or at least some in the West are going to continue trying to grasp at fiction and fantasy to the demise of more Ukrainian people. That's where we're at today. We'll wait and see how it's going to work out. Thanks for being with us today. Always appreciate you guys being here. Be sure to watch. We're going to have, we may, by the way, I'm still working on some details here, but we may be the first ones in the West to actually get an interview, a live interview with General Apte. And we're going to put some pretty hard questions to him if we can work that out there. So be watching that. It could come as early as Saturday, might also be Sunday, or it may not happen at all. We're working the details. I hope we can make that happen, but definitely watch this channel because that will be something groundbreaking that nobody else in the West has been able to put a mic in his face and ask those hard questions about, what about this and what about that? Also still have a plan to have a special announcement on Monday. That's also subject to conditions as well, but there is an announcement coming pretty soon, I promise you. So keep watching us there. And in the meantime, we are unintimidated and uncompromised to bring you the truth, no matter what it is, no matter whose toes it may step on, because you deserve to know the truth. Thanks. And we'll see you on the next episode of Daniel Davis Deep Dive.